The winter of 1853 came early to the Appalachian foothills. By the first week of November, Dead Man's Hollow was already shrouded in a frost that never seemed to melt, even at midday. Travelers along the river road would pass in silence, their breath fogging the air, eyes darting toward the dense pines on the western ridge. The place had a reputation. One whispered in stagecoach stops and saloons. Men told of a widow who lived alone in a weather-beaten house near the edge of the hollow, a woman who lit her lantern in the dead of night as if to call to lonely travelers. She was known as Margaret Ainsley, tall, pale, always dressed in black with a silver crucifix at her throat. She was said to have lost her husband in a riverboat accident years earlier. Since then, she welcomed wayfarers with hot cider and a warm fire. Some swore she was a saint to the road. Others muttered that she was cursed. That winter, something began to happen. Men disappeared, one after another, like stones dropped into a black pond, their absence rippling out through the towns. First was Elias Ford, a tanner from Lexington, then Thomas Hale, a traveling preacher. By December's first snow, 5 men had gone missing, each last seen heading toward the widow's lantern glow. It wasn't until January that the rumors turned into panic. The river froze over, a hard wind swept the valley, and yet, each night without fail, that little pinprick of light could be seen swaying in the dark, beckoning. Locals warned strangers, "Do not follow the light into Dead Man's Hollow." But of course men did. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, each one settling on the frozen earth like a whisper. No one dared to interpret. The hollow was a place where sound seemed to be swallowed whole. No bird calls, no rustle of deer through the underbrush, just the brittle crack of ice beneath a boot and the low moan of the wind threading through the bare trees. On the night of December 11th, a man named Samuel Greaves, a blacksmith from Frankfort, was the one to follow the glow. Samuel had been on the road for 2 days, leading a small mule cart with nothing but a single trunk strapped at the back. He told the innkeeper at Dawson's Crossing he had business upriver. Never elaborated, never smiled, just kept to himself over a plate of beans. Before he left, the innkeeper's wife, a heavy-set woman with hard eyes, put her hand on his shoulder and warned him to keep east of the ridge. Samuel grinned faintly, the kind of grin men wear when they've already decided the warning's just superstition. That night, a storm rolled in. The moon hid behind a shroud of clouds and the road turned into a ribbon of black ice. Somewhere between the half-frozen creek and the split oak tree that marked the turn into the hollow, Samuel saw it, the lantern, a pale yellow flicker in the distance, rocking gently like a cradle in the wind. It seemed impossibly far and impossibly close all at once, as if the darkness around it bent inward, pressing him toward it. He tried to press on past it, but the wind came howling down from the ridge, so strong it shoved the mule sideways. The cart's wheel caught in a rut, and when Samuel cursed and stepped down to free it, the lantern was closer, much closer. It swung just at the edge of the trees now, as though someone had brought it down the hill to greet him. From the shadow beyond the light, a voice called, low and melodic, "You'll freeze out here, sir. Come inside, warm yourself." The voice carried a softness that made the air seem warmer by a few degrees. Samuel hesitated, his breath curling into steam before his face. "That's your light?" he asked. A figure emerged from the dark. She was tall and slender, wrapped in a black shawl, a silver glint at her neck where the light caught the crucifix. Her hair was the shade of iron in moonlight, coiled into a tight bun. "The storm will only get worse," she said. "Leave the mule. We'll fetch it in the morning." He followed her. The path into the hollow was narrow, the snow deep enough to swallow a boot with every step. The lantern lit only a small patch ahead, yet Samuel could make out the shadowy frame of a house at the bottom of the slope, a 2-story structure with a peaked roof, its wood silvered from age, smoke curling faintly from the chimney. A faint glow seeped from the windows, a warm contrast to the frozen dark outside. Inside, the heat was immediate, wrapping around him like an embrace. The walls were paneled in dark walnut, the kind polished by decades of hands brushing against it. An enormous fireplace dominated the main room, flames leaping high, casting red light on a table set with a teapot and 2 porcelain cups. The scent of cinnamon and cloves hung in the air. Margaret. He hadn't asked her name yet, but he would pour him a steaming cup of cider. Her movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial. She spoke little, asking where his road began, where it ended, what business he carried along it. Her eyes were strange, dark but with a depth that made him feel as though she were looking through him, sorting his answers into some silent ledger. When he finally asked her name, she smiled faintly and said, "Margaret Ainsley, though most folks just call me Widow Ainsley." He nodded, unsure if it was polite to mention he'd heard whispers of her before. As the night deepened, she told him stories. Some were of her youth, how she'd grown up in a riverside town where the ferry ran day and night, how she'd married young to a man named William, who captained a riverboat. Then came the story of the night the ice broke the hull, and how she'd watched the vessel sink from the far shore, her husband's voice carried away by the river's roar. By the time Samuel finished his second cup of cider, the wind outside had risen to a scream. Margaret urged him to stay the night. "The road won't be passable until daylight," she said. "I've a room upstairs, warm sheets, you'll rest easy." Sleep did not come easy, however. The bed was soft, but the walls seemed too thin for the sounds he heard. At some hour past midnight, he awoke to the faint creak of floorboards outside his door. Then came a dragging sound, slow and heavy, like something being pulled along the hall. He held his breath, straining to hear over the pounding of his heart. The noise faded toward the far end of the hall. In the morning, the world was white and blinding. Samuel descended to find Margaret already at the hearth, humming softly as she stirred a pot. She offered breakfast. He declined. His mule, she told him, had wandered off in the night, perhaps back toward the road. She promised to send one of the locals to fetch it for him. Samuel left on foot, the snow crunching under his boots, breath sharp in the cold. He was never seen in Frankfurt again. In fact, no one saw him at all after that day. By January, the tally of missing men reached 8. A farmhand from Louisville, a trader from Bardstown, 2 brothers traveling upriver to meet family. Each one had been spotted heading toward Dead Man's Hollow. Each one was swallowed by it. The sheriff of nearby Harrow's Crossing, a man named Jedediah Crow, finally decided to investigate. He had heard the rumors of the widow, but like most lawmen of the time, he had little patience for ghost tales. Still, 8 men gone in less than 2 months was no longer a matter of whispers. It was a matter of law. He rode out with 2 deputies on the morning of January. The sky was a hard, unbroken white, and the road into the hollow felt more like a corridor than a path. They found the widow's house without trouble. Margaret greeted them politely, even offered cider, but her eyes narrowed slightly when Crow explained his purpose. "I've not seen the men you speak of," she said, "and if the hollow has taken them, it's the hollow's doing, not mine." Crow glanced around the room, noting the impeccable order. No dust, no clutter, as though the place had been prepared for inspection. The deputies checked the barn, the root cellar, even the attic. Nothing. It was Deputy O'Shaughnessy, who asked if they might search the grounds. Margaret's lips tightened. "The snow is deep," she said. "You'll find nothing but frost and fox tracks." But they searched anyway. Behind the house the land sloped into a patch of pines, their branches heavy with ice. The deputies spread out. Crow trudged further down, until his boots struck something hard beneath the snow. He knelt, scraping away the frozen crust to reveal wood splintered and warped. When they dug further, they found it was the top of a crude box, no larger than a trunk. Inside was a man's coat, stiff with frost, and a pair of boots with the name T. Hale scratched into the leather. Margaret did not flinch when they returned with the discovery. She merely shook her head. "People lose things in storms," she said. "Perhaps he lost more than most." There was not enough proof to arrest her. Not then. Crow left with more questions than answers, and by the time he returned with a warrant a week later, the snow had fallen again, deeper than before. The widow's house stood empty, the fire cold, the chimney dark. No tracks, no sign of departure, just a silence so complete it made the hair on the back of Crow's neck stand on end. By spring, when the thaw came, and the river roared again, the ground in the hollow gave up its secret. In the melting earth behind the pines, the first of the graves appeared, shallow, waterlogged, the remains twisted and pale. Then another, and another. By the end of the month, 21 men had been found, their bones scattered through the soil as if the earth itself had grown hungry. And though no one could prove it, every man in Harrow's Crossing knew whose lantern had led them there. The thaw didn't just bring the graves, it brought the stories back to life. By April, Harrow's Crossing was a village of whispering mouths and watchful eyes. The sheriff's office was crowded almost daily, with men and women coming in to speak their piece about the widow. None of them had spoken up before, not when the first men vanished, not even when the rumors thickened like fog, but now the ground had coughed up its bones. They were eager to be rid of their secret. The first to come forward was an old trapper named Ezra Tull, his beard like tangled moss, his eyes sharp and yellowed with age. He told Crow he'd once hunted the hollow for fox in his younger years, and that one winter's evening, before the trouble started, he'd come across Margaret standing ankle-deep in the frozen creek, her skirts floating in the water. She wasn't shivering. She wasn't moving at all, just staring at something beneath the ice as though she could see straight through it. When she finally turned toward him, she smiled. Only it wasn't the kind of smile a person gives another living soul. "I reckon she didn't even know I was there," Ezra said. "And if she did, she didn't care." Then came the miller's wife, Abigail Crane, who claimed Margaret had visited her only once, many years earlier, asking for a bag of rye flour. Abigail remembered her hands, pale, thin, the nails long and perfectly kept. "They didn't look like a widow's hands," she said. "They looked like hands that never scrubbed a pot or cut wood a day in their life." Abigail swore the woman's shadow seemed longer than it should have been, stretching across the mill floor, until it touched the far wall. Most chilling of all was a riverboat deckhand named Isaac Porter, who recounted that 3 winters past, he'd been traveling with a companion named Fletcher. They'd lost their bearings in a snowstorm, and when they saw the lantern swinging in the distance, Fletcher insisted on following it. Isaac refused, said something about the air near the hollow making his teeth ache, but Fletcher went on ahead. By the time Isaac found his way to Dawson's Crossing, 2 days later, Fletcher was gone. "I ain't never been so sure of anything in my life," Porter told the sheriff. That light was for him and him alone. Crow listened to every word, wrote down every account, and pieced together a pattern he didn't want to admit he saw. Every man taken was traveling alone. Every man was of a certain age, somewhere between 25 and 40. And every man, in some way or another, had been the type to linger over a beautiful woman, a habit Margaret, with her sorrowful eyes and delicate voice, could turn to her advantage like a blade in the dark. But there was a question that nagged at him. How could one woman slight, unarmed, and without help, bring down men in the prime of their strength? Even if she'd poisoned them, even if she'd struck in their sleep, disposing of 21 bodies in the frozen ground seemed impossible for anyone alone. That question haunted him when he went back to the hollow in late April. He went without deputies this time, riding alone under the gray skies of early thaw. The road was softer now, the ice broken into muddy channels, but the hollow still felt wrong, still carried that same heavy, soundless air that pressed against a man's skull. The house was still empty. The door swung on one hinge, tapping lightly against the frame as if in greeting. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood, and something faintly metallic. He walked through the room slowly, the boards creaking under his Upstairs, the first bedroom was stripped bare. No mattress, no linens, nothing but a few dark stains in the corner near the wall. The second room had no furniture at all, just a pile of river stones in the center of the floor stacked with unnatural precision. They weren't from the hollow. Crow had spent enough years fishing the local streams to know these had been brought in from the riverbank, each one smooth and wet-looking despite the dryness of the air. It was the third room, though, that stopped him cold. The shutters were closed tight, the air still. Against the far wall stood a tall wardrobe, carved with curling vine patterns. It smelled faintly of cedar and something sweeter, like dried flowers. When he opened it, the scent hit stronger. Inside, hanging neatly from a rod, were men's coats, 10 of them, all heavy winter cloth, all different in size and make. Beneath them, on the floor, lined like relics in a church, were boots, scarves, and gloves. None belonged to anyone in Harrow's Crossing. Crow left the wardrobe open. He didn't want to turn his back on it. When he stepped outside, the light was fading. He'd meant to head back before dusk, but something made him pause. Down by the frozen creek at the bottom of the hill, he thought he saw a figure, tall, black shawl, a glint of silver at the throat. She wasn't moving. She wasn't walking toward him. She was just watching. He called out, but the figure didn't answer. He blinked, and the space by the creek was empty. That night in his office, Crow took out the ledger of missing persons and began cross-checking dates. The gaps between disappearances were never random. They fell on the 11th, the 17th, or the 21st of each month. He asked himself what those dates meant, but no answer came that made sense in the realm of law and reason. By May, talk of the widow had turned into something ugly. Men in the taverns spoke of taking matters into their own hands, forming a party to cleanse the hollow. But when a group of 5 went in one Friday evening, only 3 returned, white-faced and shaking. They wouldn't speak of what they saw, only muttering that the lantern had been there waiting, but it wasn't hung from her hand. It was floating in the air above the creek, swinging slow and steady in the windless dark. The sheriff knew then this was no matter of simple murder. Whatever lived in the hollow, whether it was still Margaret Ainsley, or something that had worn her shape, was not going to be found with a warrant and a badge. And worse, he suspected it wasn't done yet. The rain came in early June, soft at first, then turning into a ceaseless downpour that blurred the hollow into a smear of gray from a distance. The swollen creek carved new veins through the valley floor, eating at the banks, and exposing roots that had slept beneath the soil for decades. With the rains came more bones washed from the soft earth and carried downstream, pale and smooth like driftwood. Sheriff Crow stood on the bank one morning, staring at the way the current tugged at a long femur before dragging it on. He had stopped sending deputies. They were no use here anymore. This was between him and the hollow now, though he couldn't have explained why. It felt less like an investigation, and more like an old debt he hadn't known he owed. That night he sat in the tavern long after the last lamp was turned down, the sound of rain hammering the roof like a drumbeat. Ezra Tull shuffled in, wet to the bone, smelling faintly of pine pitch and tobacco. He dropped into the chair opposite Crow and leaned forward. "I seen her," he said without preamble, 2 nights ago, out on the ridge, where the pines thin and you can see the river glint in the moonlight. Only," he hesitated, rubbing a knot in his beard, "it wasn't her, least, not like she used to be." Crow stayed silent, letting him talk. She was taller, her shawl was flapping in the wind, only the wind wasn't blowing. Her face, his voice cracked, like he had to force the words out. Her face was white, Sheriff, not pale like a person's skin, but white like paper, and her eyes weren't eyes anymore. Crow's jaw tightened. "What do you mean?" "Like 2 black marbles, shining but dead." She turned, and I swear the whole ridge went quiet. No wind, no rain, no crickets, nothing but. The sheriff left before dawn the next day, carrying only his revolver, a lantern and the old cross. His mother had left him. The hollow was worse in the rain, the ground sucking at his boots, the mist curling low like it meant to trip him. By the time he reached the house, the chimney was smoking again. Inside, the fire was roaring, and the table was set with 2 cups, steam curling from both. The smell of cloves and cinnamon filled the air, and Margaret Ainsley stood by the hearth, as though she had never left, her black dress pressed, her silver crucifix gleaming. "You've come a long way, Sheriff," she said, her voice soft as a prayer. "I didn't think you'd be so bold." "Where have you been?" he asked, his boots dripping on the floorboards. "In the hollow. Where else?" She smiled faintly. "It keeps me." Her eyes were dark, not black, not yet, but too deep, too fixed. She gestured to the seat across from her. "Sit. Warm yourself." He stayed standing. "I found the graves, all 21 of them. You gonna tell me why?" She tilted her head, as though he were a child asking why the sun rises. "They were mine. They came to me, every one of them, because they were meant to. Some were lonely, some were cruel, some had nothing left in them but hunger. I only gave them what they came looking for." "That's not an answer," Crow said. "It's the only one you'll get." He moved his hand to his revolver, but she didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out something small, a brass locket on a thin chain. She set it on the table between the steaming cups. "This one belonged to the first," she said. "You'll find the rest if you know where to look." When he didn't move, she pushed it toward him. Her fingers were ice cold when they brushed his. "Why keep the things?" he asked. "They keep me," she said again, and there was something in her tone, something hollow, like wind rushing through a tunnel that made his stomach turn. The rain grew harder outside, drumming the roof until it sounded like 1,000 small hands tapping. Crow glanced at the door, and when his eyes returned to her, she was gone. The cups still steamed, the crucifix still glinted in the firelight, but the chair by the hearth was empty. The sheriff didn't run. He walked out into the rain, the locket clutched in his fist.
Down near the creek, he saw the lantern again, only this time it was swinging high above the water with no hand to hold it. It drifted slowly upstream, the light never flickering despite the sheets of rain. And in its glow, just for a second, he thought he saw them, 21 pale faces, eyes black and unblinking, standing knee-deep in the current, watching him, waiting. He didn't sleep that night. By morning the locket was gone from his pocket. Crow began to carry the hollow with him, even when he was far from its ridges. The rain smell lingered in his clothes. The sound of that lantern's faint swing seemed to follow him into sleep. Every morning he checked the locket in his coat pocket, and every morning it wasn't there. Sometimes he'd find it later on his desk, on the floor by his bed, once hanging from the nail where his badge rested at night. By mid-June, another man had gone missing. This one wasn't a traveler. He was a farmhand named Daniel Pike, born and raised in Harrow's Crossing. He'd gone to fetch water from the river one evening and hadn't come back. The next morning, his mother came to the sheriff's office, weeping, clutching the empty bucket he'd carried. Crow asked her where along the river he'd gone. She pointed not toward the crossing, where the water was shallow, but toward the narrow bend that fed into the hollow. The sheriff didn't ride out that time. He walked, following the muddy riverbank for hours until the light began to fade. At the bend, the air shifted. It was subtle at first, cooler, heavier, but with every step it pressed harder, until it felt like the sky itself was lowering onto his shoulders. He heard water moving ahead, faster than it should have been in the narrow channel. When he reached the bank, he saw the lantern again. This time it wasn't floating. It hung from the low branch of a sycamore, its flame steady despite the wind coming off the water. Beneath it stood Margaret. Her shawl clung to her shoulders, like wet paper, her hair loose and dripping. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eye. "You've been keeping watch on me," she said. "I'm trying to end this," Crow replied. Her laugh was short, sharp. "You can't end what doesn't want to end. The hollow takes what it's promised. It's older than me, older than this town. What's it promised?" "Love," she said simply. "The kind a man will follow into the dark, even if he knows it'll be the last thing he sees." She took a step forward, and he saw something behind her, half in the water, half in the shadow of the bank. It was Daniel Pike, or what was left of. His skin was pale as milk, his hair plastered to his skull, and his eyes were black as the hollow itself. "You can take me," Crow said, the words leaving his mouth before he knew he meant them. "If it stops here, if no one else is taken." Margaret's head tilted, the crucifix glinting with each movement. "You think you'd be enough? The hollow doesn't care for bargains. It feeds until it's full, then it waits to be hungry again." The lantern's light brightened, burning gold against the The faces came again, men he recognized from the missing persons ledger, their mouths just slightly open, as if whispering a name he couldn't hear. He drew his revolver, but his hand shook. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was the sense that the gun was no more useful than a pebble against a river's current. She watched him, unblinking, as he fired. The shot cracked through the air, and the bullet passed straight through her. She didn't fall. She didn't even flinch. The water behind her rippled, but she remained. The sound of the river grew louder, until it roared in his ears. When he blinked, she was gone. The lantern swung empty in the tree, its flames snuffed out. The river was calm again. Crow staggered back toward town in the dark, the weight in his chest growing heavier with each step. When he reached the edge of Harrow's Crossing, he could already feel the hollow pulling at him again, like a rope tied around his ribs, tugging him back. That night he dreamed he was walking the creek bed in his bare feet, the stones slick beneath him. The water was black, but warm, and the faces were there, circling him. Margaret stood on the bank, holding the lantern, her eyes fixed on him. She didn't speak, but her lips moved, shaping words he couldn't hear. When he woke, the locket was back around his neck, clasped tight.
By July, the air in Harrow's Crossing felt wrong. It wasn't just the heat, though the summer bore down thick and wet, turning the days into long, sticky stretches of stillness. It was the way the silence crept in at night. The cicadas that usually sang until dawn went quiet. After midnight, dogs wouldn't wander beyond their porches, and people had begun locking their doors at sunset, though no one could say what they were afraid of without their voices cracking. Sheriff Crow felt it most in his sleep. Every night now the dreams came faster, sharper. He would be standing in the hollow, the lantern swaying somewhere ahead, its light never quite enough to reach his feet. Sometimes he followed it, sometimes it came toward him, and always, when he woke, the locket was somewhere new, on his nightstand, in his boots, once tucked beneath his pillow like a child's keepsake. 3 more men went missing before the end of the month. Not travelers, locals, a cooper, a young schoolteacher, and an old drunk who'd been sleeping in the hayloft of the mill. None had reason to leave town. Each was last seen walking toward the river in the late afternoon, as though drawn by something no one else could see. Crow started to notice other changes, too. In the mornings, the air smelled faintly of cloves and cinnamon, even in his office with the windows closed. Some evenings, just as the sun dipped behind the ridge, the shadows on the street seemed longer, darker, almost liquid, and once, just once, he swore he saw Margaret standing in the reflection of his window, even though the street outside was empty. He told no one. Who would believe him? Harrow's Crossing was already slipping into its own quiet panic. On the 2nd week of August, Crow decided to try something desperate. He rode out before sunrise, carrying a small iron box lined with salt, a Bible, and a length of chain. If the hollow was going to keep reaching for the town, he meant to cut it off at the source. He would find the graves, dig them up, and move the bones to consecrated ground. The ride in was uneventful, but the closer he got, the more the mist thickened. By the time he reached the pines, the world was gray, the shapes of the trees blurring like smudges on glass. The air was cold here, colder than it should have been in summer, and every exhale hung like smoke. The first grave came easy, loose soil shallow, but when he lifted the lid of the coffin, the bones weren't there, only a set of clothes, laid out neatly as if waiting for someone to step into them. The coat, the boots, the gloves, all stiff with frost that didn't melt in his hands. The second grave was the same. By the third, he was shaking not from the cold but from the knowing that grew in his gut. These weren't graves anymore, they were empty rooms, ready for their next guest. A sound came then, soft, like the rustle of skirts in dry grass. He turned, hand on his revolver, and there she was, Margaret, standing in the mist, the lantern in her hand. Her face was as pale as moonlight, her eyes black as the spaces between stars. "You're late," she said, her voice low and calm, as though she'd been expecting him. "I came to end this," Crow replied, though his voice sounded smaller than he meant it to. "You came because you're mine." He took a step back, but the ground seemed to tilt toward her. The air between them pressed in, thick and heavy, until it was hard to draw breath. The graves yawned open around them, waiting. "You've been carrying the locket," she said. "You've been dreaming my dreams. You've been breathing my air. You think that leaves you free to walk away." He wanted to raise the revolver, but his hand wouldn't move. His fingers felt numb. "Every man who's come here thought he had a choice," she went on. "Not one of them did." The mist swirled, and for a moment he saw them, the 21 men, and now more behind them, their faces pale, their eyes empty. Daniel Pike, the cooper, the teacher, they stood in a loose circle around the graves, their mouths just barely open, whispering in unison. He couldn't hear the words, but he knew they were speaking his name. The lantern's light flared, casting long shadows that twisted over the ground. Crow felt something cold touch the back of his neck, like a hand guiding him forward. He stumbled toward the nearest grave, his boots sinking into the soft earth. Margaret didn't move. She only watched, her lips curving into that faint, unreadable smile. "You'll rest easy here," she said, "and when you wake, you'll light the way for the next." He fell to his knees at the edge of the open grave. The locket was tight against his throat now, the chain cutting into his skin. The whispering grew louder, closer, until it was all he could hear, and then silence. When he looked up, she was gone. So were the men. The graves were closed, the earth undisturbed. He was standing alone in the pines, his boots dry, his hands empty, but the locket was still there, and this time, it was warm. Crow stopped returning to the hollow after that day, but the hollow didn't stop returning to him. It began in small ways. His lantern at home would sway gently in the still air, as though touched by an invisible hand. Footsteps would creak across his floorboards at night, stopping outside his bedroom door. Sometimes in the corner of his vision, he'd see the faint shape of a shawled figure slipping into the next room, only for the room to be empty when he entered. He told himself it was exhaustion, that the summer's heat was warping his mind, but deep down he knew better. The locket never left his neck now, no matter how hard he tried to remove it, pulling until the chain cut his skin. It would not break. It pulsed sometimes, faintly, like a slow heartbeat. By early September, Harrow's Crossing began to notice changes in the sheriff himself. He was quieter, slower to speak, and he no longer went out after dark. Those who saw him in the late evening swore his shadow stretched longer than the lamplight should have allowed. Children whispered about the way his eyes caught the light, glinting too dark, too deep. The disappearances didn't stop, but they changed. Now the missing weren't always men. A woman collecting herbs by the riverbank, a boy who'd gone fishing with friends, a merchant passing through at noon. They vanished without pattern, without reason, yet somehow everyone in town knew the hollow was still the mouth swallowing them whole. One night, a young deputy named Harris decided to check on Crow at his home. The sheriff hadn't been seen in 3 days, and though Harris knocked for a long time, there was no answer. The door wasn't locked. Inside, the air was cool, unnaturally so for late summer. The rooms were neat, almost too neat, the kind of order that doesn't feel lived in. On the table sat a single cup, steam curling from it despite the cold. The scent of cloves and cinnamon clung to everything. Harris called out once, twice, no answer. Then he saw it. In the far corner, a lantern swaying on a hook, though no breeze stirred the air. Its light was low, golden, and inside its glow stood Sheriff Crow, only, not as Harris remembered him. His face was pale, his eyes black and glassy. Around his neck hung the locket, the chain now buried into the flesh as though it had grown. "You're out late," Crow said softly, his voice almost gentle. Harris tried to speak, but his mouth went dry. Crow smiled faintly, a smile that wasn't quite his own. "It's colder by the river," he said. "Let me show you." The lantern bright. Harris felt his feet move before his mind gave the order, carrying him toward the door, toward the dark outside. The next morning, the deputy's horse was found wandering the main road, saddle empty, and that night, for the first time in living memory, 2 lanterns swayed in Dead Man's Hollow. And so Dead Man's Hollow keeps its secrets and its hunger. Sheriff Crow, whether man, ghost, or something in between, walks its banks under the sway of that cursed lantern, and the missing keep joining the silent procession in the dark. If you've ever heard of a place like this, if you've walked somewhere and felt that invisible rope tug you deeper, we want to hear your story. Share your thoughts and theories in the comments. Maybe you'll notice something we've missed. If this tale kept you watching until the end, make sure you like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell so you never miss another nightmarish case from the shadows of history. We've got more stories, some true, some whispered legend, that will leave you questioning every creak in the dark. Until next time, keep your lantern close, and don't follow the light if it swings without wind.